The air inside Greenwood Plaza carried the familiar hum of a bustling shopping mall. Conversations blending into one another, the rhythmic beep of cash registers and the occasional squeal of a child tugging away from their exhausted parent. Bright neon signs reflected off the polished tile floors, creating a lively, almost hypnotic glow. The scent of freshly baked pretzels and cinnamon rolls wafted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of designer perfumes from department stores. At 72 years old, Eleanor Carter had seen countless days just like this one. Shopping malls were nothing new to her, and neither was the subtle undercurrent of tension that often came with being a black woman in predominantly white spaces. But she wasn't here to dwell on that today. Today, she just wanted to buy a few things. A small gold bracelet for her granddaughter's birthday, a new pair of comfortable walking shoes, and maybe a nice sweater if she found one on sale. Dressed in a simple, well-pressed beige coat, her silver-grey hair tucked neatly beneath a knitted hat, Eleanor carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived through decades of struggle and perseverance. A retired high school teacher, she had spent her life educating young minds, often fighting battles inside and outside the classroom, not just about history and literature, but about dignity, respect, and fairness. Even in her golden years, she wasn't someone who simply turned a blind eye to injustice. As she walked past the crowded food court, she noticed a group of teenagers huddled together, laughing over milkshakes, a mother trying to wrangle two toddlers into a double stroller, and an elderly couple arguing over whether they had already paid for parking. It was a normal scene, the kind she had witnessed 100 times before. And then she heard it. A raised voice, a sharp edge of frustration. Eleanor's gaze instinctively shifted toward a shoe store up ahead, where a young black man, barely out of his teens, stood at the counter, his hands moving animatedly as he tried to explain something to the cashier. His face was flushed, his breath uneven, the kind of anger that didn't come from rage, but from sheer frustration. The cashier, a pale young woman, looked nervous. She kept glancing toward the security desk near the entrance, shifting on her feet like she wasn't sure what to do. Eleanor slowed her pace, something in her gut telling her to pay attention. She wasn't the type to meddle in other people's business, at least not without reason. But this? This felt different. The young man's voice cracked as he spoke, his words clipped but firm. "I have money. Just run the card again." The cashier hesitated, shaking her head. "I can't. It declined once. Store policy." A hard silence settled between them. Eleanor knew that silence. She had heard it before, in classrooms, in grocery stores, in places where young black men were automatically seen as troublemakers. It was the same silence she had fought against for years, the same unspoken assumption that had denied so many opportunities, so many simple dignities. For a moment, she considered walking away. Maybe it wasn't her place. Maybe she should mind her own business. But then the cashier's voice wavered as she whispered, almost pleading, I don't want any trouble." That was all it took. Eleanor Carter turned on her heel and stepped forward. 2. A simple purchase turns into a standoff. Eleanor Carter had spent decades navigating moments like these. She knew what it was like to walk into a store and feel the weight of suspicion pressing down before she had even said a word. She had seen it happen to others, students she taught, neighbors she loved, even strangers on the street. And now, here it was again. The young man at the shoe store counter, who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, clenched his jaw. His frustration was evident. Not the kind of anger that suggested violence, but the kind that came from being unfairly dismissed. His brown eyes flickered with disbelief as he tried to explain himself. "I already told you, there's money on that card." The cashier, a petite woman with wide, uncertain eyes, looked helpless. She shook her head, her fingers gripping the register like it might somehow protect her. I can't run it again. Store policy." Eleanor sighed. She had been here before, not this exact store, not this exact moment, but in the same exhausting situation. She could see both sides. The young man felt accused, and the cashier felt pressured. But there was a way to de-escalate before things spiraled out of control. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Son, take a breath." The young man turned toward her, surprised. His hands were tensed, but his breathing slowed slightly. Tell her what's wrong, clearly. The cashier looked relieved that someone else had stepped in, but before either of them could speak, a heavy-set mall security guard approached. His radio crackled at his hip, and his expression was already set in stern disapproval. What's the issue here? Before anyone could answer, before Eleanor could even turn to explain, another voice sliced through the tension, louder, sharper, carrying authority. Step away from the counter. The moment the words were spoken, something shifted in the air. Officer Bradley Connors had arrived. Eleanor turned, and as soon as she saw the look in his eyes, she knew. He wasn't here to listen. Connors wasn't just any cop, he was the cop. The one people whispered about. The one with a reputation for being quick with his hands, and even quicker with his temper. The kind of officer who walked into a situation, decided who the problem was in seconds, and never second-guessed himself. And now his gaze had locked onto her. "Ma'am, I said step away." His voice was sharp, his hand hovering near his belt, where his taser and gun rested. Eleanor blinked, confused. "I was just trying to—" Connors took a step closer, towering over her. "I gave you an order. Do I need to repeat myself?" The young man at the counter, Andre, looked between them, his hands now balled into fists at his sides. "She was just helping," he said quickly. Connors didn't even glance at him. "Last warning, lady, move." Eleanor should have been afraid. Maybe another woman her age would have backed down, lowered her head and walked away. But she wasn't just any woman. She had seen too much, lived too long, and survived too many battles to be intimidated by men like this. "I'm not interfering," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just making sure no one gets hurt over something small." Connors's nostrils flared. He took another step forward, now close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I don't need a lecture." His tone dropped, something darker creeping into it. "Back. Office now." The mall security guard, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. Even he could see this was unnecessary. Eleanor sighed, raising her hands in a slow, deliberate motion. "All right, officer. No need to be aggressive." She turned, preparing to walk away. But Connors wasn't done. "Stop right there." She turned back, her brows furrowing. "I'm leaving." But Connors shook his head, flipping open his notepad like he was already preparing to write something down. "What's your name?" Eleanor frowned. "Why would you need that?" Connors smirked, his confidence unshaken. "Because I'm writing you up for interfering in an investigation." The crowd was growing now, people were watching, phones were coming out, and Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Officer, I was just trying to calm things down. There was no—" Connors cut her off. "Give me your ID, ma'am. Now." Something in his tone made it clear. He wasn't looking for cooperation. He was looking for an excuse. Eleanor's grip on her purse tightened. She didn't like where this was going. 3. When de-escalation fails, a moment of power and prejudice. Eleanor Carter had been in tense situations before. As a retired teacher, she had spent decades diffusing conflicts, talking down students who were angry, frustrated, or misunderstood. She knew the power of a calm voice, measured words, and steady composure. But none of that mattered here. Because Officer Bradley Connors wasn't interested in de-escalation. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked onto her like she was a threat, not a 72-year-old woman who had done nothing but try to keep a simple misunderstanding from spiraling out of control. And yet, here she was, a black woman being treated like a criminal for daring to speak up. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She lifted her chin, keeping her voice even. "I don't have to give you anything, officer. I haven't committed a crime." The crowd around them shifted. People were watching closely now. Phones were up, capturing every second. And Connors didn't like that. His hand twitched near his holster, not reaching for his gun, but enough to send a silent warning. Eleanor had seen that gesture before. It was the same move officers made when they wanted to remind someone who held the power in the situation. The same silent threat that had kept generations of black men and women in line. But she wasn't playing that game. She stood her ground. The tension in Connor's face tightened, his grip on his notepad firm. Then, without hesitation, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch," he said, pressing the button, his voice cool and controlled. "I have a non-compliant suspect at Foot Locker, requesting backup." Eleanor stiffened. Suspect? People in the crowd murmured in disbelief. Andre, the young man at the counter, took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Man, what? She didn't do anything. Connors ignored him. His eyes were still locked onto Eleanor, as if she were the only person in the store. Last chance, he said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. Give me your ID, or I will be forced to detain you. Eleanor's pulse slowed, her mind racing. A younger version of herself might have argued, might have fought back with logic, with reason, with an appeal to basic decency. But she knew better now. She had seen how these stories ended. She had read the headlines. She had heard the names, people who had refused to comply, people who had tried to stand on principle only to end up as hashtags and news stories. So she reached for her purse, slow, deliberate. She wouldn't give him an excuse. Her fingers brushed against her wallet. And then he shoved her, hard, a forceful, deliberate push to her shoulder. She stumbled backward, catching herself against a clothing rack. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Someone shouted, "Yo, what the hell?" A woman's voice cut through the noise. He just pushed her. Oh my God. Eleanor clutched her arm, her eyes wide. She hadn't expected that. Not that quickly. Not like that. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't resisting. She was barely even moving. But Connors was breathing heavier now, his chest rising and falling like a man ready for a fight. And then he did what no one expected. He snapped. The air inside the mall shifted. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see if this would become one of those stories. The kind you read about. The kind that ends up in shaky phone footage with millions of views for all the wrong reasons. And Officer Connors? He didn't disappoint. His patience snapped like a rubber band stretched too thin. His hand shot forward, fast, a blur of movement, and then, crack. His fist connected with Eleanor's face. A sickening sound echoed through the store. Eleanor's body folded beneath the impact, her legs giving out as she hit the cold tile floor. Gasps, screams. Someone shouted, "Oh my God!" A man's voice, sharp with rage. Did he just punch her? Eleanor lay there, her cheek burning, her vision blurred. She touched her face, feeling the sting of raw skin, the place where his knuckles had struck. Her glasses had been knocked off, lying several feet away, the lenses cracked. She barely had time to process what had happened before she felt it. The crushing weight of a knee pressing into her back. Connors was on her now, his hands grabbing at her arms, twisting her wrists behind her back. "Stop resisting," he barked. Resisting? She wasn't resisting, she was barely conscious. But that didn't stop him, didn't stop his knee from pressing harder, didn't stop his fingers from gripping her like she was a dangerous criminal. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore, they were yelling. A man stepped forward, his phone recording. "Get off of her!" A woman's voice, choked with emotion. "She's an old lady, what the hell is wrong with you?" Andre, his face red with anger, tried to move closer. "Man, you've lost your damn mind." But Connors didn't care. His hand gripped Eleanor's wrist tighter, yanking her arms behind her back. He reached for his cuffs, ready to make an example out of her, and that's when it happened. A voice, deep, commanding, unmistakable. A voice that shifted the entire energy in the room. "Get your hands off my mother." Everything froze. Officer Connors's grip loosened just for a second. His knee was still pressed into Eleanor's back, but his face changed. For the first time since this all started, there was a flicker of something in his expression, not remorse, not guilt, but hesitation, like something inside him had just clicked, like he had just realized what he had done. The crowd parted, and there he was. Julian Carter, tall, broad shoulders, a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it cost more than Connor's entire paycheck. He wasn't just a man, he was a presence. And behind him, two other men, just as sharply dressed, their faces cold, unreadable. Connors didn't know them, but the way the crowd shifted, the way whispers turned into recognition, told him that everyone else did. 4. The moment everything changed. The air inside the mall felt different now. The energy had shifted. For a moment, everything froze, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge the weight of what had just happened. The sound of people breathing, whispering, recording, it all seemed to fade into the background. And in the center of it all, Officer Bradley Connors, his knee still pressed against Eleanor Carter's frail back, his hand gripping her wrist too tightly, his breath still sharp with adrenaline. But now something was different. Now his confidence, his arrogance, was met with something he hadn't expected. A force greater than his badge. "Get your hands off my mother." The voice was low, firm, controlled, but it carried the weight of power. Connors blinked. For the first time, hesitation crept into his face. The crowd parted like water, making way for a storm. And there he was. Julian Carter. Not just any man, not just a son furious at what had just been done to his mother, but a force, a presence, a reckoning. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, his suit impeccably tailored, his eyes dark with controlled fury. And behind him, two men, just as well-dressed, just as unreadable, just as dangerous in their silence. Connors didn't know them, but the way the crowd shifted, the way the murmurs turned into recognition, told him that everyone else did. And that's when real fear crept into his face. But his pride, his instinct for control, wouldn't let him back down so easily. His grip tightened around Eleanor's wrist, his knee still held her down, pressing into her back. He swallowed hard and forced his voice to stay steady. She resisted arrest, he spat. She refused to comply. Julian took another step forward. Connors realized just how tall he was, but Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply let his rage settle beneath the surface like an ocean before a hurricane. Let her go. Connors hesitated for the first time that day, for the first time in a long time. And then one of the silent men behind Julian finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost bored, but it carried the weight of finality. "This is the part where you stop digging your own grave, officer." Connors turned toward him, and that's when he saw it. The man wasn't just anybody, he was holding up a badge. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. And just like that, Connor's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a bad day caught on camera, this was about to become a career-ending mistake. His breath hitched, but he tried to hide it. Tried to reassert control, tried to calculate a way out of this mess. But Julian wasn't waiting anymore. He crouched beside his mother, his focus entirely on her, ignoring Connors like he didn't even exist. His voice, once filled with power, now softened as he reached for her hand. "Mum, are you okay?" Eleanor winced, the side of her face swollen, her body trembling, not just from pain, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened. Her voice was weak but steady. "I'm okay, baby." But everyone could see that she wasn't. Julian's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening into fists, his rage barely contained. But he didn't lash out. He didn't have to. Because the DOJ official standing behind him wasn't playing games. He stepped forward, his expression neutral, but his words filled with a quiet authority that left no room for debate. "Officer Connors." Connors finally let go of Eleanor's wrist, his knee lifting from her back. She took a sharp breath in, finally able to breathe properly again. The DOJ official continued, "Step away from her. Now." And this time, Connors obeyed. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew he had no choice. Julian helped his mother sit up, one hand steadying her while the other gently picked up her broken glasses. The mall was silent. No one moved, no one spoke, until a woman's voice, thick with disgust, cut through the quiet. "He hit an old woman." And just like that, the weight of what Connors had done settled over the entire room like a storm cloud. He could feel it now, the stares, the cameras, the judgment, the realization that this moment wasn't going away. Then his partner finally stepped forward. Officer Rebecca Morris. She had been standing nearby the whole time, watching, silent and frozen in disbelief. Now her voice was tight, almost choked as she whispered, "Bradley, what the hell did you just do?" Connors glared at her, as if daring her to challenge him. But she wasn't backing him up. Not this time, because even she knew this wasn't defensible. And then the DOJ official turned to her. "Officer Morris, we need his badge, now." She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew. This wasn't just the end of Connor's day. This was the end of his entire career. Slowly, wordlessly, she stepped forward and reached out. Connors flinched, like the metal badge clipped to his uniform was a part of his skin. But she didn't stop. She unclipped it from his chest, and just like that, it was over. He was no longer a cop. The mall security team moved in, escorting him away. Not in handcuffs, not yet. But it didn't matter. Because this was only the beginning of his downfall. The moment Officer Bradley Connors's badge was unpinned from his chest, the entire mall seemed to exhale at once. For a long second, he just stood there, his face drained of color, his hands twitching at his sides. He had spent years in control, years walking into situations where his word was final, where people feared the power he carried on his hip and in his badge. But now the weight of what he had done was sinking in. Now he wasn't just another cop enforcing the law, he was the lawbreaker. And everyone had seen it. Phones were still up, capturing every second. The mall security stepped forward, ready to escort him away. His career was over, and yet Connors still hadn't moved. He was still calculating, still searching for a way out, still hoping there was some way to spin this. His eyes darted toward Julian Carter, the man who had just torn his world apart with nothing but words and presence. And then Julian spoke again. His voice was measured, calm, but deadly. Firing him isn't enough. The words sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the crowd. Julian's hands were still steadying his mother, still gently holding on to her as she adjusted her broken glasses. But his eyes, they were locked onto Connors. He needs to face charges. Connors's breath hitched. The DOJ official, still standing beside Julian, nodded once. Oh, he will. And that was it. That was the moment Connors realized the full weight of his mistake. This wasn't just about losing his badge. This wasn't just about public outrage. This was about prison. His stomach sank as the DOJ official turned to the officers behind him. We've already contacted Internal Affairs. Charges will be filed. The whispers in the crowd turned to murmurs of approval. Connor's partner, Officer Rebecca Morris, still looked pale, as if she were witnessing a funeral. In a way, she was. Because Bradley Connors, as a police officer, no longer existed. This wasn't just a bad day gone viral. This was the end of everything he had built. The end of his power. The end of his control. And as he was finally led away, the realization settled in his gut like a heavy stone. This was only the beginning. Because this time, there would be no covering it up, no brushing it under the rug, no quiet reassignment to another department. This time, he would pay. The aftermath, a nation watches. By the time Eleanor Carter was being helped into an ambulance, her son beside her, the video had already gone viral. The footage was everywhere. CNN, MSNB, Twitter, Facebook. The headline: Racist cop attacks elderly black woman in mall, her son's response leaves him speechless. It was all over social media. It was being shared, discussed, dissected. The mayor released a statement within hours. Officer Bradley Connors has been placed on unpaid leave, pending a full investigation. But people knew what that meant. It meant they were scrambling. It meant the police department was trying to control the damage. Too late. The country had already decided. Within 48 hours, the police chief stood at a podium, his face grim, his voice carefully controlled. Officer Connors has been terminated, effective immediately. But that wasn't enough, because Julian Carter wasn't done. Firing him is a first step, he told reporters, but accountability doesn't stop there. We're pressing charges. And with the DOJ involved, everyone knew Connors wasn't just losing his job, he was losing everything. The legacy of a fight well, fought back at the hospital. Eleanor Carter sat in a hospital bed, bruises fading but her spirit unshaken. Her son sat beside her, his expression still unreadable. She reached over, placing a wrinkled hand over his. You didn't have to do all that, baby, she whispered. Julian shook his head. Ma, I did what any son would do. She smiled, squeezing his hand. No, son, you did what every person should do. Stand up, speak out, never stay silent. Because silence, that's how they get away with it. That's how it keeps happening. And this time, it wasn't going to happen again. Eleanor Carter sat in her hospital bed, the bruises on her face already turning deep purple, a painful reminder of the violence she had endured. But as she looked around the small hospital room, she realized something. She had survived. Not just that moment in the mall, not just the humiliation of being thrown to the ground like she was nothing. She had survived a lifetime of this. She had lived through Jim Crow, through marches where she had been spit on, through times when a black woman raising her voice was considered dangerous. She had seen men like Bradley Connors before, and now she had seen one of them fall. Julian sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly together, his suit jacket resting on the chair next to him. He had been quiet for the last few minutes, staring at the floor as if his mind was already working 10 steps ahead. She reached out, placing a hand over his. "You did good, baby." Julian sighed, shaking his head. "It's not enough, Ma. He's fired, yeah. He's facing charges. But how many more are out there just like him?" She nodded slowly. "Then we don't stop." Her voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of generations who had fought before her. "We never stop." The video of Officer Bradley Connor's downfall spread faster than wildfire. By the time Eleanor Carter was discharged from the hospital, the footage had millions of views. News anchors dissected every frame, legal analysts debated the charges he would face, and activists called for wider police reform. This wasn't just one bad cop making a bad decision. This was a system exposed, again. The outrage was immediate, but something felt different this time. This time, people weren't just angry, they were done being patient. The protests started within days, not just in their city, but across the country. Signs reading, "Justice for Eleanor" and "Accountability Now" filled the streets. Julian Carter, who had spent his career fighting injustice in courtrooms, now found himself leading a movement. He hadn't planned for this, but he wasn't walking away from it either. He stood at rallies, his voice steady and powerful. "My mother was lucky, she survived." He paused, looking out over the sea of people. How many others didn't? The crowd roared in agreement. Change wouldn't come easy. It never had. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. Days turned into weeks, but the fire never died. Eleanor Carter became more than just a victim. She became a symbol of resilience, injustice, and the power of speaking out. Her name was on news banners, protest signs, and social media posts across the country. But for Eleanor, it wasn't about fame. It was about demanding something better. Sitting in her living room, a cup of tea warming her hands, she watched the latest news segment. The mayor had announced new police training policies, and the DOJ had opened an official civil rights investigation into the department. It was a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. Julian sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, reading updates on the case against Connors. "He's looking at federal charges now," he muttered, his tone unreadable. Eleanor nodded, taking a slow sip of tea. "Good. But this isn't just about him, Julian." Her son looked up. "This is about every mother who didn't have a camera there, every son who never got to speak up, every name that became a hashtag instead of a survivor." Julian exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know." Eleanor reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "Then we keep going." Her voice was calm but certain, because this wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for all of them. And it wasn't over. Eleanor Carter had always believed in standing up for what was right. But now she saw just how powerful one voice, her voice, could be. What happened to her wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, part of a system that had failed too many for too long. And now the world was watching. The footage of Officer Bradley Connor's actions had sparked outrage, but outrage wasn't enough. People wanted change. Real change. Julian stood at the podium of another rally, looking out at the sea of faces. Young and old, black and white, men and women, all standing together. He took a breath, then spoke. "My mother survived, but how many others didn't?" A wave of agreement surged through the crowd. How many names did we chant, only to watch the system let their killers walk free? More voices joined in, shouting, chanting, demanding accountability. Julian's voice steadied. "We can't just let this be another trending video. We can't let this moment pass without real change. We have to demand it. We have to fight for it." The crowd erupted. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride and determination. This wasn't just about her. It was about every injustice that had been ignored, every voice that had been silenced. And this time, they wouldn't be silent.